Okay, so I'm joined today by Tom Sheppard from HealthBid. Tom, welcome and thanks for speaking to me today. First of all, just tell me a little bit about yourself and a bit about HealthBid and what you guys do.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me first, Lloyd. I appreciate it. Well, as you said, I'm Tom Sheppard. I'm the Managing Director of HealthBid. We're a bidding organisation based in Leeds who helps out clients looking to work with the NHS across the UK. So we've been going now for getting on for 6 years. We're the largest specialist healthcare bid company in the country. We employ around about 15 people up here in Leeds, and we're really specialist in staying in that health lane, really helping our clients to grow and to win contracts.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, really interesting that you've got that focus, and actually that brings us to kind of the topic of today's discussion, right, which is all about how to sell effectively to the NHS. And Tom and I had a bit of a pre-chat before this discussion, and I'm thinking back to times that I've spoken to people about selling to the NHS and really understanding how the NHS works. And for me, it's really mind-blowing, all the different parts of it and how complex it is. So I'm really happy to be speaking to an expert who really understands all of this stuff. So yeah, let's kick off with my first question for you then, Tom. So the first one is, how does selling to the NHS differ from selling to other public sector organisations?
Well, I mean, I'm pleased you're bringing me on as an expert, because I feel like I lack still quite a lot of expertise. The NHS is so complex and healthcare is so complex as a sector that I think it really taps into that question that you've asked. There's no simple way of selling to the NHS because it's so interconnected with lots of different other things. And fundamentally doesn't really want to be sold to. And that makes it quite hard as people who want to sell products to the NHS to break into it. So, we do quite a lot of work for local authorities because public health sits with local authorities. And we see a real difference to the way the NHS tenders and the way that local authorities tender. Local authorities tend to be a little more open, a little more, give you a little bit more flexibility in how you want to deliver a service. The NHS tends to be a bit more rigid and have some pretty strong ideas about how a service wants to be delivered. So there's definitely differences there. I suppose the other thing, which is more a difference in the type of service you're selling, but in the NHS, a lot of what we do is the selling of services rather than products. And that is a totally different challenge from a sales point of view. If I'm selling gloves to the NHS, then they want to know, are they safe? Can they be delivered on time? Are they good value? If you're selling smoking cessation services, there's so many more factors there about how you reach difficult communities, how you ensure long-term outcomes, that the difference is quite stark, I think, with other organisations.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to just pick up a point you made there, actually. And obviously the NHS is something which is very close to people's hearts in the UK, right? It's quite a kind of protected organisation that people feel close to. So you mentioned something about the NHS not wanting to be sold to. So I just wanted to dig into that a bit more. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I definitely wouldn't describe them as hostile to people selling to them, but I think there's a suspiciousness of the public sector versus the commercial sector, and you see that quite often manifested in the way that they approach the market. So, if you're commissioning a service in the NHS, then you want to have a lot of people bidding, because that's good for the market, it's good for the value, but more importantly, it's good for the quality of what you're delivering. You can look at a range of options in how to do it. So smoking cessation is a great example of where there's quite a lot of different ways to encourage people to quit. Some better for rural communities, some better for inner cities. You want that wide market. Instead, what we see quite a lot is them being very closed with the way that they want to engage with the market, because I think they're worried that they're going to be tricked into something. Now, in my experience of working with a lot of both public and private sector bidders, there's no huge difference in terms of what people want to get out of it. The overwhelming majority of people we work with want to improve services for people. Yes, some of them want to make some money while they do it, but none of them, as far as I know, are sitting in the Bahamas on the profits that they're making from smoking cessation contracts. And I think that there's that perception that the private sector is sort of out to get you somehow within the NHS.
Interesting. That's interesting as well, that it kind of that plays across from a kind of societal view, if you like, into the organisation as well. Because I think if you look at that on a kind of society level, some people are obviously clearly quite against, selling to the NHS being privatised, etc.
Yeah.
But even if we had a NHS with very little privatisation, there would still be, suppliers providing services to the government.
I think so. And there's definitely the NHS is inherently bound up with politics, and that's obviously a very political question about who should provide services. But I think that what the public perhaps doesn't appreciate is how many services are and always have been provided by the private sector. GPs, the overwhelming majority have never been directly employed by the NHS. They're run as effectively small businesses. Pharmacies, similarly, they obviously, people know Boots and Lloyd's, but they don't think about that when they're going to pick up a prescription. Well, that's the private sector companies. So I think that it's that view of the private sector as sort of being out to get the NHS is, I sort of think they would have done it by now if they really were out to get them. And again, there's not really enough money in healthcare for that to be very attractive to people.
Okay, good. All right. Well, look, I'm kind of sending us on a slight segue for a second, actually, because there was a second thing that you mentioned, which in the first bit of discussion we had, that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to bring up, as long as I understand it properly, to make sure that others do as well. And that is this idea in the health service that the NHS is effectively bidding on its own work in a lot of cases versus private sector companies, right? If I understand that right, and that isn't something you see in local authority or in other. So yeah, can you just talk to me a bit about the reality of that, what happens and how you experience it as a company who helps others bid?
I mean, it definitely does happen. I think that the NHS is more developed in this regard than a lot of the public sector, just because market forces were introduced into the NHS in the early 90s, really, and so that split between the commissioners buying stuff and providers providing stuff is quite well established. And I think that where in local authorities, where they've split out the provision of certain services, those have gone straight to the private sector and effectively disappeared out of the public sector entirely. Whereas, there's a lot of the NHS that you just cannot get rid of out of the public sector, even if you, going back to the politics, even if you wanted to do that. So definitely private sector organisations bid against public sector organisations for NHS contracts. However, I don't think it's particularly bad news for private sector companies, because firstly, NHS organisations, I think, have a better idea about what they want to provide and what they don't want to provide. So if you look at the local hospital here in Leeds, they want to provide, well, they may not want to, but they don't have a choice about providing things like A&E and operating theatres and stuff like that. And for everybody other than one or two massive private sector providers, they don't want to provide that anyway. If you look at stuff like smoking cessation, sexual health services, things that are out in the community, then there's quite a lot of innovation, both in the private sector and the third sector. And I think that the NHS has got past the point where it thinks all innovation sits within the NHS. They do see that there are other ways of doing things in those types of roles. So I think what's happened, especially over the last 10 years or so, is the NHS has slowly let itself lose those services. It could bid on those things, but it's not bidding on them because, it's not what it sees as its core purpose. The bad news is for the private sector is on the occasions where they are bidding against the NHS, it's tough to win. It's always going to be hard to win against the home team effectively when you're bidding against an NHS organisation.
So on that, Tom, just to dig into that a little bit further, does that mean for a lot of organisations in their kind of bid, no bid process or their gated process that they're going through, finding out that there would likely be a kind of NHS bidder, would that be one of the reasons why somebody might not want to bid?
For sure, and it's something which we see all too often actually is that people approach us to write bids and they haven't done that process of bid, no bid. I think that amongst new providers, there's a certain amount of naivety that you can just bid on a contract and win it, and therefore you are running millions of pounds worth of services. And, you know, that does happen, but it's uncommon. The sales side of a bid can't be neglected. You know, and I say this as somebody who's selling bids, you know, you can't just come to somebody like HealthBid and just win. You know, we need to know, why should you win this? Who are your competitors? You know, if you're a new startup, how are you going to beat an NHS provider who's been there for 30 years and has established relationships? The truth is you're probably not, and there are better opportunities for you somewhere else. So I'm a big advocate of pre-sales in bids, that before you get to the bid side, you've done that research. And that's something we help clients with. And I think, as you say, is something which needs to be relatively sophisticated to make sure that people aren't wasting either money with an organization like us or just their own time to write bids. It takes a lot of time.
Good stuff. Great intel on that one, Tom. Thank you very much. So the next question I wanted to ask you was about the structure of the NHS. From people from the outside who don't understand the NHS, one of the most kind of baffling aspects of it, so many different organisations, there's CCGs, trusts, there's all these different terms for different parts of the organisation. Can you try and give us, if it's possible, quite a succinct summary of kind of the structure of the NHS, and I suppose in the context of how it's important to people who want to kind of, you know, get their products and services into the NHS to help with patient outcomes?
Sure, I'll keep it brief, so it'll only take 3 or 4 hours, I think. As I say, I've been working in healthcare both in the NHS and out of the NHS for 20 years, and I'm still not sure that it's very clear to anybody, including people who work in the NHS. I think the fundamental thing, the basics to understand, are that there's commissioners and providers. And as we alluded to earlier, in most other sectors, there's a really clear split. You know, people are buying stuff and then people are selling to those people. In the NHS, it's less clear cut because, as you pointed out, the people selling are often the NHS themselves. And so the NHS is buying from the NHS. So getting that split between commissioners and providers is the first most important thing. The second thing I think it's really useful for people to understand is that most entrants to the market are not going to be selling stuff to a hospital. You know, there's big logistics firms, huge manufacturers who are providing most of what a hospital wants to buy. So, you know, because hospitals are literally a visible part of the NHS, I think people think that's where the commercial opportunities are. And I'm not saying they're not there, but they're harder because, you know, a hospital's a massive hotel, a massive healthcare institution, a massive waste producer. It's just too big for a lot of providers. Where the opportunity lies, I think, is in the community provision. And so people, when they're thinking about the NHS structure, you know, you've got commissioners and then you've got providers. Those providers split into what you call acute care or secondary care, which is hospitals, and then community provision, which is often called primary care or community care. And that's GPs, it's a whole range of community nursing services, public health, and then the things that support that. So innovative IT systems, things like that. So, you know, that's those sort of splits, commissioner versus provider, and then types of provider are probably the best place for people to start. A lot of the rest of it, you just need to work out which of those boxes it sits in. So there's a lot of talk about ICSs at the moment, which are the new thing, integrated care systems or services, depending on which day of the week it is. And so, you know, people get really obsessed. Well, what is that? What does that mean for me buying stuff, selling stuff, sorry. Well, the first thing to do is to work it out. Are they commissioning things? Are they buying things? Or are they providing things? And who's doing what within that organization? I always think it's a mistake to get too far ahead of where the NHS is. We've had some very enthusiastic clients talking about their ICS strategy, and that's great, but it's going to take the NHS a while to implement this stuff. And in that time, you don't want to neglect the fact that you could still be selling to other people. So those commissioners, the people that you're trying to sell to, fall into a couple of camps. There's, as you said, CCGs, so clinical commissioning groups. They're purchasing on behalf of a region, a relatively small region usually. So Leeds, Wakefield, London is split into a few different CCGs, and then you've got obviously rural ones as well. They're a good place for people to start looking at where opportunities lie. They're commissioning lots of services, they're buying lots of stuff, and they present, you know, multiple opportunities a year. Plus, there's 170 odd of them, and so you've got all those opportunities multiplied by all those CCGs. If your organisation's got a national footprint, there are lots of opportunities there. The second place to have a look is in some of the provider organisations. So people like GP practices need to buy stuff. Now, some of that stuff, you know, is done centrally, but a lot of it, and maybe a surprising amount, is done locally. So if you produce a piece of software that really helps GPs to make better clinical decisions or to prescribe the right type of medication first time, then there are opportunities there to sell directly to GP practices. They do exist. One of the advantages of the NHS being so complex, as I said, is that there's in some ways surprisingly little central purchasing that's being done. So, you know, if you're finding it hard to sell your product and service to your local CCG, there's the next door CCG and there's the other one next door to that. And, you know, there's less crossover between those than you might think. So yeah, structurally, I would say commissioners, providers, different types of providers, and then work out where the organisation that you want to talk to sits within that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Some really good insight there. And I think, yeah, the idea of kind of, okay, there isn't this centralized kind of holy grail of this is who you go and speak to sell, right? But that's also balanced by there's lots of different opportunities potentially at community level or at local level where things are being done maybe in a kind of, you know, in a very localized way.
And the example I always use when I'm talking to people starting at HealthBid is that is toilet paper. You know, every sort of few years there'll be a report into procurement in the NHS, and they say, well, you know, why can't we just buy the same rolls of toilet paper for every single NHS trust? Fundamentally, that's very difficult because the NHS, if you did that, would be like the largest single purchaser of toilet paper in the world, or in the top 2 or 3. And so there's only 1 or 2 companies who can literally provide that amount. So if people are daunted looking at the sort of scale of it, you can break it down into smaller constituent parts. And that sometimes, especially for smaller healthcare organisations coming into the market, is a good way to go. You know, rather than aiming at the NHS, you know, when on Dragon's Den they say, well, we just need 1% of the entire board game market. It's like, well, that's an enormous challenge. You don't need to provide it to all of the NHS, certainly to get started. You need to just find, you know, 1 or 2 of the smaller organisations to do it.
Great advice. Great advice. Okay, so next let's talk a little bit about data, and that's obviously very close to our hearts at Tussle. So what role do you think that data plays in selling to the NHS?
So, I mean, first and foremost, I think that it plays a big part in the bid and no bid decision making. You know, if you look at data and it says the same organisation has won this contract for the last 30 years, and then the next door organisation has been to a different provider 5 times in the last 30 years, then I would always go for option 2 because it tells me that the person buying that is willing to change. So, you know, first and foremost, does the data help inform me about whether I should bid on a particular contract? When you're doing the pre-sales, pre-bid work in that sort of sales phase as well, if you know that a contract isn't due up for another 5 years, then there's no point in wasting time. In the NHS, it's unlikely it will be the same people running that contract in 5 years' time. So even if you thought, well, I'll play the long game here, it's usually not worth it. So that type of data is really helpful in informing whether or not you should bid. Secondly, when you get to the bid, data both that you have on yourselves, but also that you have on the competitors and the commissioners is super helpful. You know, anything you can do to show that you have insight into what they need that's a day-to-day challenge for us with our clients. So, you know, we're writing a bid at the moment for an organisation who's bidding on a community service. Part of our job is to make sure we understand the data for the local area. So it really sounds like a bid for that place. rather than sounding like a generic bid that could be for anyone. So I would say that really helps with the bid process. The final part is if the data is telling you something about how the contract will operate, then that helps you to price it well. And I mean that both pricing to win, but also pricing so you don't ruin yourself and end up going bust. And it does happen.
Yeah.
So, I would say pre-sales, great for bid, no bid. During the bid process, great for winning the bid. And then during that sort of solution design and into the contract section, you've got to know what you're going to be able to, how you're going to be able to deliver it within the budget.
Yeah. So a great mix of, you're talking about kind of some more kind of deeper, more qualitative stuff on the kind of the needs of the organization as well, versus on the kind of competitor market intelligence side, just that information on who holds the contract at the moment, how often they've renewed, etc. Yeah, that's
yeah, and also, if you look at those competitors and their small businesses or their local businesses or their massive multinationals, those are things that tell you something about how you should write the bid. If we're writing against a massive multinational company, then we're all about localism and the fact that this contract's super important. When we're writing for massive multinational companies, we're there talking about the size and the resilience of that organization. So you can only do that if you've got that insight into who you're up against.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about kind of advice that you might give to others who are looking to break into the NHS for the first time, because I think you can have this for companies of all different sizes, and we hear it often talking to companies who are interested in the NHS. We hear a lot of kind of, we've tried and it's too complex, or just kind of they're nervous about kind of breaking into the NHS or the healthcare market in general as a new challenge. So what kind of 3 key bits of advice would you give for a company who's looking to break into the NHS for the first time?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, you've got to understand what your product and service is and make sure that it does solve a need that the NHS has. We hear quite a lot from new organizations, especially software stuff, where people have come up with a good idea, often that's based on a problem they've personally had with the NHS. And they think, well, I've invented a new way of measuring, your heart rate or something. And it will save the NHS billions and all the rest of it. Well, that's only helpful if it's solving a problem the NHS has. There might be a million other bits of software that do that already, and they're being produced by, whoever, huge multinational companies who can make sure it never goes wrong when they need it to go to work. So firstly, you've got to understand your products and service and make sure that it's something that is viable in the NHS. It's not good enough to just know a GP who tells you, yeah, it's a good idea. That GP is speaking for themselves. They're not actually buying anything. So proper market research, I think, is really, really important. Secondly, understanding that it's a long game. It's very rare that somebody comes along and just immediately breaks in. I think, especially with things that are tendered, that are bid for, there's a perception that if you just write a great bid, then that's all it takes. And it's not true. I like to think, the best bid writers in the business, and we can't win everything because sometimes it's just not what the person buying wants to buy. And so, it takes multiple attempts. It is sometimes a little bit dispiriting because the NHS, again, doesn't always like to say no. It would be nice sometimes if they just said, no, we don't want to do that. And instead they'll invite you in for a meeting and they'll give you a demo, and then you're getting excited. And 6 months down the line, you're still getting excited, but there's no sale being done.
Yeah.
So be prepared for the long haul. And then thirdly, I think, try and speak their language somewhat. It's not easy because there's a lot to learn, but try and understand that selling to a GP practice, for example, is very, very, very different from selling to a hospital. And you need to understand their language. They see that, I think, as the credibility that you're bringing to the table. Most people, certainly clinicians working within the NHS, haven't worked in other, they've only worked in the NHS or for another healthcare system abroad. So they don't have an MBA and understand sort of MBA type language. They understand NHS type language. So you need to be able to speak in that way. It's not to say you need to be an expert. It's perfectly possible to pick stuff up, but you've got to be ready to do the work to understand their language and their challenges in those terms.
Yeah. And I think it's a good, the first, if I just circle back to the first point you made as well, it's incredible how many organizations struggle with just what do we do and who do we do it for? And is it clear? And then, as you say, the second part of that, does somebody really need this? And it's interesting that kind of, I guess that plays across for organizations in private or public sector, but you see it as so important in the NHS that people come up with these ideas and they think, I suppose because it's health and it's so emotive that people think this is going to be game changing, but actually they need to just test that idea a bit more, right?
Yeah, and to think through the implications of the product or service they're trying to sell. So, if you want to bring in a new bit of software for the operating theatre, and it makes things safer for people and it saves money. You think to yourself, well, this is obvious, like it makes sense, it's safer and it saves people money. But it's incredibly complex how that operating theatre runs. So, adding even like a browser extension, something super simple, can't be done because their systems have to work in a particular way every single time, because that's ultimately what the surgeon's relying on to make sure that they're treating somebody to the best of their ability. So you've got to think through how your products and service links with other products and services. And therefore, is the cost of this just the cost of buying my product? Or actually, is there also, 10 weeks of management time, in which case, the NHS got to pay for that. I don't know if people know, but the NHS is super busy at the moment. And so do they have the time to do that? There's a lot of inertia there that you've got to overcome.
And what's an example of something that you see organizations doing wrong? So we've talked about some advice you would say about the things that they would do if they wanted to break into the NHS for the first time. But what do you see that organizations of kind of, ideally of all different sizes, that you see them doing wrong regularly that actually stops them being more successful in the NHS?
Yeah, I think what we see really often, and an easy one to correct as well, is that people think of the NHS as a single national organisation. And so they're trying to sell to the NHS, which is not true. It's not true and it's not possible. Every part of the NHS, apart from a few very small bits, is localised. And so, I'm not trying to sell to the NHS, I'm trying to sell to a group of GPs in South Leeds, or I'm trying to sell to an NHS hospital in Hull. Those are two very different things from selling to the NHS and selling to those smaller units. So when you're preparing your sales strategy, when you're going through the types of data that you need, Hull Hospital ain't bothered about the national data that supports you because they've got to make their budget work and work for the people of Hull. So you need to come at them with good local knowledge. And then when you come to selling and writing, it's about making sure that you reflect that knowledge in what you do. It's no good going to a potential sales target in the NHS with, here's the saving the whole NHS would get, or here's a service that works really well, but it assumes that everybody's got good public transport to their local hospital. Those things might be true to some extent in London, in Birmingham, Manchester, but they're not true if you go to a smaller town. And so, you've got to make sure that what you're selling is localized to the bit of the NHS you're trying to sell to.
Yeah, that is really, thanks for sharing that, Tom. That's a really powerful bit of insight, I think. And that plays into how people set up their sales teams, right? And their entire kind of organization. It feels like something which is much more localized and focuses on what do those individual communities need, and is there a kind of community or grouping focus that you can set up your sales team in that way? That sounds like a much better recipe for success than saying, where's this one organization that I want to go and sell to?
Yeah, and I think people, especially in the world that I'm in with bids and tenders, they get blinded by national frameworks. So they see there's a national framework coming out for, but there's one that just opened yesterday actually for digital outcomes. So, it's a consultancy type framework, and people say, right, all I need to do is be on that framework. And, it's good to be on that framework. I'm not dissuading people from going on it, but you've not even half done the job by getting on that framework, because people underestimate how much local power people have not just to decide which framework they use and say, well, I'm not interested in that one, I'm going to use this other one, but also just to buy stuff outside of that process because, they found a great provider. And so the best way of doing that is to actually get 3 quotes rather than using the framework. So, you can get blinded by the NHS as a national organisation and say, I mean, this framework says it's worth £120 billion. It's like, well, how much money is actually being done through it? And how much of that is not being done by the big 5 accountancy firms,
Brilliant. Well, look, I think that's a really good note to end on, is understanding, where to put your focus, this kind of community level selling that you're talking about. And I think that there's been some really, really powerful insights in this chat, Tom. So thank you very much for coming on and talking to us. And for everyone, go and check out HealthBid. We'll drop a link in our blog when we write this up. But Tom, thanks very much, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Lloyd. Appreciate your time.